Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. My guest today is Paul Levy, who is a workshop and seminar leader based in Portland, Oregon. He is the author of The Madness of George W. Bush and Dispelling Wetiko, about which we've done a previous interview. He has also written The Quantum Revelation, a radical synthesis of science and spirituality. Today, however, we're going to talk to him about his personal story, an encounter with the psychiatric system, an encounter with evil within his own family, as described in his book, Awakened by Darkness, When Evil Becomes Your Father. Once again, this is an internet interview, and I'll switch over now to the internet video. Welcome, Paul. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here, Jeffrey. Thank you.
We're going to be talking about your life story. I know from having read your book, it could only be described as an ordeal. And I think that it's an ordeal that lasted for decades. I assume because some of the primary events took place nearly 40 years ago, it's taken you a very, very long time to process what happened.
Yes, that is definitely true. And it's an ongoing process. It's not like, it's clear to me that I'll be dealing with this process for the rest of my life. But historically, in time, it really, happened close to 40 years ago. And it was such an unbelievable, overwhelming trauma that almost killed me. It destroyed my family. It almost drove me crazy, or it actually did drive me crazy for a while. But somehow I was fortunate enough to, as I went through it, to realize it was this initiatory process, and slowly being able to connect back with myself and to extract the gifts from the process that informed just the creativity that just flows through me. But it is such an unbelievable story.
Now, I've talked to people who have gone through great suffering and unbelievable suffering. Motorcycle accidents, time in prison. And sometimes those people tell me they got so much benefit from the learning that occurred that if they had to do it all over again, they would. In fact, some say in a heartbeat, they'd do it again. Would you describe yourself that way?
No, I would. I'm getting there, because my experience, and I'm just being honest, my experience was a direct, unmediated encounter with absolute archetypal evil. And I'm very aware that a lot of people go through, traumas and say, oh, I would choose to do that again, and I'm so happy. The closest I get to it is that out of the experience came my work. And I've written these books, and they're really helping people. And a little while ago, I began to contemplate, well, what if there was a universe without the books that I've written, compared to being in a universe where these books are actually, they're incarnate. And I realized, no, I would choose the universe where the books are actually, in form. And that was to choose that, because the books were a direct result of what I went through. So that's as close as I've come. But it was so, unless you've had your own version of a direct encounter with archetypal evil, that's trying to destroy you, you can't relate. And so I can't authentically say, oh, I would choose it again. I'm still a work in progress in that way.
But the books are symbolic, really, of your own inner state. You're the guy who wrote the books.
Yeah. No, totally. And I'm aware of that. And the books for me, like if I hadn't connected through this process with with just the creative spirit that lives in me and finding my voice, then I would have been in trouble, and that wouldn't have been a good outcome. But the fact that, that I've created this work about, this mind virus or the collective psychosis or the revelations of quantum physics or how all of this is a dream, and, how there are so many different dimensions of my work that are actually really helping people. And I'm aware that that's the real fruit of having gone through this ordeal. And slowly, kind of like, I'm in no way a shaman. I mean, I'm only a shaman in my wildest dreams. I kind of joke with my friends about that. But I'm aware of that archetype, that it's by going through this death sort of rebirth experience and encounters with the darker forces and going mad, that if the shaman, if they don't get stuck in that realm, in the underworld, they can potentially, recover gifts that they bring back to the community. And, I'm very fortunate when I see, there is like a part of that process that seems to be happening through me.
The story really begins when you're a young child and you first encounter your father, who is capable of exhibiting enormous, explosive, diabolical rage, and then either forgetting it ever happened or acting as if this is perfectly normal, and somehow managing to get other members of your family and at one point even the psychiatric community to sort of treat it as if he's the normal one and you, who are the victim of that rage, are abnormal.
Yeah, no, that's exactly true. And just so to maybe give a little form to the story. So, like I just anyways, I've always been under the illusion that I had a happy childhood. Let's put it that way. That illusion was recently dispelled. I spoke to Gabor Mate just recently, and he was asking me about my father, and I was presenting, I had a happy childhood up until the abuse happened when I was in college. And he very quickly, like a heat-seeking missile, just unpacked and showed, well, your actual childhood couldn't have been that happy if you had a psychopathic father like that. And I realized that. But the real problematic aspect happened when I was in my college age years, and I began to individuate and separate from my father, who I didn't know was so fused with me and unconsciously identified with me that when I was actually stepping out of his image of who I was supposed to be and actually was beginning to individuate and become myself, which was by definition separate from my father, he all of a sudden, it unbeknownst to me, it activated, you could say, the archetype of the myth of the negative father, who feels jealous and threatened by their son as they individuate and tries to kill them. That's really, in essence, the archetype of the negative father, and or to possess them. And so basically, as I was just, in a completely loving, healthy way, expressing my own separation and individuation, that consolated my father to just completely go into murderous rages where I was literally afraid I would be killed. And I understand now, he had left, and his vehicle was possessed by an archetypal, darker spirit that was using him as its instrument to act itself out into the world. I didn't understand any of that from the psychological point of view, but why I'm so fluent psychologically is that I had to come to terms with what actually happened, because it was like he had become possessed by something. And then he was just completely letting go and surrendering to this violent emotion where not only was he raging, but then he'd have heart attacks. And his mantra was, "You're killing me." So I was having this double thing about, I'm afraid I'm going to be killed, and getting this guilt induced by, him having the heart attack. So then that kept on happening again and again, a series of episodes, until the worst one happened Thanksgiving night, 1978. The next day I woke up with a fever, and I had a fever for a year. And the doctors, I went to hospitals, doctors, they couldn't find anything wrong with me physically. And at the end of that year, finally, I had felt well enough that I moved away from New York. I just graduated college, to the West Coast, to the Bay Area. And as soon as I got to the Bay Area, all of a sudden, something happened that literally stopped me from living my life. And what it was the abuse that had played out that year before, all of a sudden had become internalized in my psyche. and was getting constellated at every healthy impulse. So any sort of impulse to, oh, let me go for a walk or play basketball or go for a bike ride or just breathe the fresh air or go in the woods, anything that was like wholesome and healthy and a Paul activity would constellate the raging, hateful, blaming, dying father in my own head. It was like that figure, that entity that had possessed my father had now gotten internalized and was living inside of me. I had, to my horror, internalized the demon or the trauma. And now my father didn't need to do anything. I was just doing it on myself. And I went from a highly accomplished person to not being able to live my life. And it so stopped me that's when I went inwards. And the only thing that alleviated my suffering was just doing meditation and just assuming the position of the witness. And that's after almost a couple years of doing that, hours and hours and hours a day, every day, I had a whole awakening, and that's a whole other story, because I was so enthusiastic and excited about what I was realizing, i.e. that we're having a collective dream, that it got me in deep trouble and got me thrown in hospitals and diagnosed. And that's a whole other part of the initiatory ordeal. But why I bring that up is that I began to realize, oh, wow, the same darker forces that were animating my father when he would become possessed then came through psychiatry, just in a different form. And that's when I began to realize, well, there's like a non-local field that was informing through different channels, my father's psychiatry, that was informing the way things were manifesting. And I guess one final thing about that's when I began to first be introduced to what I would later write books about, because I realized, wow, whenever I was trying to shed light on the abuse or on the darkness that my father was playing, the whole non-local field would configure to actually protect the abuser. And I began to realize, wow, that's like a deeper process. And of course, now we see that happening, with the church or with Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein or a whole number of people, that when somebody is trying to shed light on a darker shadow or if there's abuse, just watch what typically happens. The field will, configure and conspire itself so as to protect the darkness and to demonize the light. And I was realizing just the horror of that. That was an indication for me of when I talk about, archetypal evil, but it was also revealing something to me. It was showing me something really deeper in the fabric of the universe and in my own mind. And that's when I began to realize, oh my God, the evil forces that are playing out that almost destroyed me and literally consumed and destroyed my entire family. I haven't had a family for close to 20 years and all that, that entails just having to live with that. But I was realizing, oh my God, there's this revelation encoded in the abuse. And that was when I began to extract the blessing aspect of it.
One of the points that you make is that in many different spiritual traditions, what we call evil or diabolic or demonic is understood to be actually an instrument of the Buddha nature of the universe, or a creation of the deity, the highest deity.
In that energy, that with its diabolical quality, etymologically, diabolic means that which separates and divides. So on the one hand, on one level of the dream, when you see this as a dream with multiple dimensions, on one level, this demonic energy was just trying to destroy and also separating, because I was so close with my mother. And once my father assumed the position of the abuser, and I tried to talk about it, and my mother aligned with my father, it separated, it destroyed our relationship. When she died, we had hardly any relationship. It was tragic. So there was some sort of darker, diabolic, demonic energy that, behind the scenes was playing out what was happening. And what you're pointing at is, and what I'm pointing at too, is that, it could have just completely just driven me out of my mind. And, for me to encounter the depth of the evil that was playing out in my process through my father in psychiatry and the field and around them. But what really saved me, and this is what you were just pointing at, Jeffrey, that encoded in that darkness, that it's actually showing you something. It's actually this living revelation that when you begin to see that, it's like a quantum phenomena encoded in that evil is like the darkest destructive energy, and it's actually this revelation. And how it's going to manifest, because it can destroy you or it can wake you up, depends on if you're able to see the revelatory aspect of it. And then that's what happened for me between like what played out with my father and the whole family protecting him, and then psychiatry coming in and protecting my father. It was like I began to realize, oh my God, there's like a higher dimensional process going on here. And that's what saved me, seeing that.
Well, if we look at human history, it's punctuated with all sorts of atrocities, genocides, oppression of every kind, criminal activity at the highest levels that gets supported by society. There are totalitarian governments and dictatorships. So it seems to me that eventually that sort of oppression and evil is going to work its way into various families. Now, not everybody has it so directly as you did, but I think probably all of us have had a taste of that.
Well, that's exactly true, because the individual or the family, the microcosm of the family, is an iteration of the deeper macrocosmic fractal of the world, of the collectivity. So yeah, being that there's this, sort of darker energy that pervades the collective unconscious or pervades the field, of course, any of us as microcosms, be they individuals or a family system, is going to like somehow like play out that very energy in whatever form they do. And and I just want to comment on, so with the abuse from my father, it was like, particularly that last night, there were increasing episodes like I described, and then the next day I had the fever. It was like think of me like this vase, like I was a glass vase, and it just got like broken just got shattered, and something entered me. It was like getting a transfusion of that very evil. And that's why it took my whole mind body dealt with it by having a fever for a year. I realized that later. And then at the end of that year, then all of a sudden that demonic, entity or energy was now inside of my own psyche. So it was like getting a transfusion of that evil energy. But that's where, and like I'm saying, I'm no shaman at all, but that's where the shamanic archetype really plays in, because a shaman, takes on the illness of the world or of their client or of the community, and they literally fall ill themselves. And I've had a creative illness, a shamanic illness, for decades. And but slowly, they're able to metabolize that poison, that illness, and bring themselves back to, center, to health, to their wholeness. And, like I'm saying, I'm still a work in progress, but I feel, particularly with my work, that as I found my voice and my creativity, that's the very, because encoded, what I'm also discovering is that encoded in that evil is the creative spirit. And, which means that for us to really be able to exorcise or transmute that evil is to actually connect with the creative voice inside of us. And thankfully, that's what I've been doing, and it's like the fuel of of my creativity is the darker force. And so that's why it's so important. And like I was saying, a shaman somehow is able to metabolize that illness, that evil that it's interesting, they take it on, which means they confront it, but also it means to take it in oneself. So it's to experience the evil, not just objectively like it's outside, but to experience it from the inside. Subjectively, that, you are it, but to not identify with it. That's the danger, where once you take in that darkness, if you identify with it, then you just unwittingly, unconsciously become an instrument to act it out on whoever. But the idea is to like experience it from the inside and then to distinguish yourself from it. That's the shamanic trip of how they actually assimilate the darkness. And, I'm not talking, like I said, I'm like an intellectual person who studies this. And I'm certainly not an accomplished shaman, but I'm somebody who's been deeply 24/7 in this process. And I've had to learn it, or it would have killed me, definitely.
We can see over your shoulder on this image, you have the complete works of Carl Jung. It looks like on the bookshelf. And I know in your writing, you quote his alchemical studies, and you quote also many other theological writers, many of whom take the notion of diabolic energy as literal, as if there's some autonomous energy. And yet the psychologists say, well, it's actually, it might seem like that, but it's really an aspect of the psyche. And you seem to go back and forth quite a bit between these two perspectives, as if really they're both valid.
It's interesting because that idea, like on the one hand, if you invest, this evil, for example, with like this reality in a certain way, you could conceivably be investing it with an unwarranted reality that it doesn't deserve, really, in the sense that, like, I bring in quantum physics saying there's nothing objective, so people who think there's an objective devil or evil force, well, no, that absolutely is not true. But then if people just say, oh, well, then it's just your projection. No, this evil, it's not just imagination. It's not just projection. It somehow exists in a like this intermediate realm, and all we know is that subjectively, I can talk for myself. Subjectively, I experience it as if it's some autonomous other entity that's other than myself, right? That's how my subjective experience. But I don't want to then jump ahead of myself and then assume, oh, because I experience it subjectively as if it's objective, that doesn't mean it exists objectively. That's just the way I'm subjectively experiencing it. See, I'm being very accurate or trying to be careful in my language because I feel that that's where people get really confused. So you don't want to also give it this objective existence that it doesn't deserve. It's not just subjective, even though subjectively we experience it as if it's objective. And what is its reality? Well, I certainly don't know. I'm very comfortable though in holding sort of the both and, that it's just like, part of my own self and it exists out there and, would seem contradictory or exclusive. And I'm comfortable with holding both and not just like having to reach a conclusion that it exists one way or the other. But I want to say psychologically, not theologically, but psychologically, evil is as real as we are, and its effects are all around us. For people, I know a lot of New Age people who just dismiss evil and say, oh, it's not really real. I think they're just completely deluded because, and by having that viewpoint of thinking evil's not real, well, then you're unwittingly offering yourself to be an instrument for evil. You're colluding with evil by doing that. But the paradox is that if you think evil is real, then you're also colluding with evil by like investing it with a reality that doesn't deserve. You see, all of this is pointing at the nature of the beast we're dealing with. Okay. And so the point is, psychologically speaking, evil is as real, as you can get. And how it shows up, not just playing out in our world, but that's reflecting that deeper evil in us. And not just personal evil, but archetypal evil that we all interface with. And that's, in a way, the blessing of what played out with my father. It's given me such an unbelievable deep insight into the nature of evil. I've had to, or it would have killed me.
Back to your story, as I recall, after you moved to Northern California, Berkeley, where I spent quite a bit of time myself in those years, you had a kind of an awakening, but it was such a powerful awakening that one of your best friends assumed that you were going crazy and had to be hospitalized.
When it was all a direct result of the intense over-the-top trauma that I, was feeling as a result of the abuse with my father. And I went so inwards. I had this whole awakening, and I was just a free agent. I wasn't contained in an ashram or a monastery or anything like that. And so I was so, in a sense, out of control. It was kind of like, taking a hit of acid, and at a certain point you have that fork in the road. You either still try to control your process, or you just let go of control. Well, it was like that, but I just completely let go of any outcome. And, so from people who knew me, from their point of view, it was like having this radical personality change. And my subjective experience was I was realizing we were having a collective dream. And, but I wasn't skillful in, how could I be? It was like overwhelming me with the force of this revelation. And I couldn't have possibly been prepared as a 24-year-old kid to understand what was shown to me. I'm still close to 40 years later unpacking and understanding the revelatory aspect of what played out, because something was being shown to me. But for that first couple years, 4 or 5 times I was hospitalized, diagnosed, medicated. The doctors guaranteed I would have this mental illness for the rest of my life, that if I went off the drugs, I would immediately have a psychotic break. And as they're diagnosing me, I'm diagnosing them as just being incredibly stupid. It was so obvious to me that I was having an awakening. And I realized whenever I would express that would be more evidence to them confirming their viewpoint of my mental illness. So then I realized, I better shut up and I better just not talk about what I'm experiencing. But then I was realizing, but wait a second, that's the same process that played out with my father, where once again, my voice was being shut down. So here's an example that I was beginning to recognize the iterations of a deeper process of all of a sudden, wow, that's interesting. Whenever I tried to express myself, my light, my voice, the field would respond by shutting it down, whether it's with psychiatry or with my father. And, that got my attention. And so being in psychiatry, it was like descending into the underworld, into a hell realm. It was so crazy making that I just literally couldn't believe it. So they were pathologizing me, and I was in this completely open, vulnerable state and going more and more off balance, because all I needed was just to be contained and recognized and supported. But instead I was being judged and pathologized. So I was going more and more off balance. And so then once psychiatry got me, which was, within the first day, and they began pathologizing me, that contributed to, that made me sick, and then once I expressed that or exhibited that, then that confirmed to them their diagnosis in a self-perpetuating feedback loop, as if they were casting a spell and they were in the business of making people sick. And the more I was trying to point that out, the more I was pathologized for what I was reflecting in a way that was completely maddening. And it was total abuse. It was overwhelming abuse that the whole system of psychiatry was perpetrating on their patients. But somehow I was traveling through it and taking notes. And so anyways, I could just go on and on about that, but I was lucky to escape psychiatry with my life and with my sanity intact.
Interestingly, all of this happened around the same time as the anti-psychiatry movement was becoming quite popular. You quote in your book the writings of R.D. Laing, and his work was, I studied in the 1960s as an undergraduate. It was very popular at the time, but apparently not particularly popular with the psychiatrists you were dealing with.
They were just so entrained. The DSM-III had just come out the year before in 1980, and that was the edition announcing the big discovery of the chemical imbalance. And so every single psychiatrist was diagnosing me as, being chemically imbalanced. And of course, then a number of years later, the same, psychiatrists, the authors of the DSM-III have since come out and said, by the way, there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance. That was totally a bogus, made up diagnosis that was inspired by the pharmaceutical companies so they could sell more drugs, so they could make more money. And yeah, so that was that was just horrendous. And the tragic part was that my parents both died completely, in their minds, psychiatrists were authority figures. So, and my father then had written the narrative whenever I was trying to point out, the darkness, the evil that was coming through him. And there was a family secret that I found out that he perpetrated before I was even born that literally broke up his birth of origin family. It was so evil. And he just so split off from it that then he acted it out. But I didn't know anything about that. But so my parents, my father wrote the story, and my mother gave him, the credibility by, protecting him. So the whole family aligned with my father, and I had become the identified patient. I was the one who was seen as sick or evil or abusive. And that was, and that went on for years until that was just a nightmare beyond belief. And then when my parents both died close to 20 years ago, then the rest of the relatives have basically, ostracized me, and, I'm not included in anything. I haven't spoken. They haven't called me in close to 20 years because I'm the one who's supposedly the sick and crazy one. And, and that's just really painful. But I've had to deal with that. I've had to live with that. And it's actually more even inspired, my work.
At one point, Paul, all of this actually got you in trouble with not only the psychiatric system, but also the criminal justice system. And you describe actually very eloquently being raped inside of the Santa Rita jail.
Yeah, totally. And just, it's a perfect example, I think, of, when you have a spiritual awakening and it's not sort of contained and supported, but yet pathologized and judged, how you can go a bit out of control. So how I got arrested, and how I got arrested, it's kind of a funny story in that I was having this awakening and I was realizing who I was and who we all are, our Christ nature, our Buddha nature and all this, but it was getting slightly more and more out of balance. And so what began happening, there was one day that I was writing these checks, and I was going around town buying stuff and writing checks. And, and for way more than I had in my account. And my thinking was, I was, this is an example of how I was veering off balance, of tuning into, I have infinite abundance, and no, it'll be covered. So that was clearly like an expression of being off balance, combined with having the realization of, I was realizing, wow, I'm the Buddha, I'm the Messiah, we're all the Messiah, we're all Christ. Oh my God, we could dream ourselves awake. But I hadn't integrated that. So there was just such a sense of inflation at that point. Absolutely. Which is like, that always happens when you actually all of a sudden have a connection with the higher self. The unconscious tendency, and you recognize that is who you are, is to identify with it. But that's a natural part of spiritual awakening. It's like with this if you shoot like this rocket ship, out through the atmosphere, it has to have enough rocket fuel to break the Earth's atmosphere. And that's when, but then, the rocket fuel just, it can drop off just very naturally. It doesn't need, that's kind of example of when there's inflation, you have a direct encounter with the higher self, you identify with it, you inflate to break out of the atmosphere of your conceptual mind. But then if you still hold on to that, that's inflation. But if that just, naturally lets go, it's, then, you actually develop a relationship with the higher self instead of just becoming identical with it. That's the inflation. So that, what I described with writing the checks, that was still a residue of my inflation. So then I went to, it was an eyeglass store on Shattuck Avenue, and I wanted to buy a pair of sunglasses. So I wrote them a check, and they called up the bank, and the bank said, no, don't accept his check. And I said, no, I stand for it. I'm good for this. I'm, because I was identified with my Buddha nature, but I was still, suffering from inflation. And so then they made one more phone call. They said, well, just hold on 1 second. And then, 5 minutes later, the police came and they arrested me, and they brought me into Santa Rita, that's where I was raped. And I talk about that in my book. And and that was a horrible thing. But it was in a full-blown spiritual awakening. So my experience of it was not from the ordinary state of mind. But when I look back upon that, I see now, yeah, that was like my descent into the deepest, darkest, underworld that I could imagine, and yeah.
The story reminds me a little bit of a Zen phrase that I've heard called the stink of enlightenment. And I think if you were in an ashram or a monastery or a place where they understood what you were doing, you would have had a supportive environment around you. But instead, you were really in the grip of this American culture with all of its grace and beauty, but with all of its darkness and evil. And you experienced the dark underbelly of the society that we still share.
One way of saying that is that if anybody had my experience in an indigenous culture, they would understand, oh, this person, might be being called to be a healer or a teacher or a shaman or something, like that. And, and they would take care of them. They would support the person. They would make sure they were safe. Because all that I needed, I see this now. I mean, it was pretty obvious, is that I just needed to have a container to just, because the wildest creativity was coming through. I was having these revelations. I was connecting with some of the greatest enlightened teachers in the world, like, not in my imagination, but in actual fact. And they told me a number of years later, oh, we were recognizing you were having some form of awakening, that you weren't just a crazy person, but, all consensus reality, everybody, all of my friends at that point, they just thought, oh, Paul is, whatever, having a nervous breakdown, psychotic break. And but it's all perfect when I look back upon it, because like I'm saying, at a certain point I realized all of that was part of like the initiatory experience. It was like, I was traversing these darker realms, and that's enfolded throughout the collective field and obviously inside of my mind. And I've just been fortunate, like I said, to be able to, extract the blessing and connect with my creativity. Because when I talk about archetypal evil, one of the things that saved me was after the last hospitalization in '82, I began having night after night these dreams that were showing me what was happening, that were just completely blowing my mind. And I knew nothing about dreams at that point. But I quickly figured out I have to understand what is this showing me? And so it was really, kind of shedding light on the archetypal dimension of evil that I was confronting. And an example with my father, he literally wanted to possess me like I was an object for so that he wouldn't have to face himself. And he just spent his dying breath doing that. And that's kind of what I mean about it was the myth of the archetypal negative mythic father, who just wants to possess their child. And so I mean, honestly, I'm just thankful that I got through it, because it easily could have crippled me or disabled me. And I openly share in my work, I feel crippled. I feel totally sort of in this wounded state, because when you have an encounter with and I think with just archetypal evil, which is different than just personal evil, you can't even imagine how different it is. It reconfigures you, or at least it has me. It deformed me in a way. It completely changed the trajectory of my life and of my mind. But I've just been fortunate to be able to carry it in a way to find my gifts and create my work in a way that's actually helping people. And that's the archetype. That's the archetype of the wounded healer, which is the shaman, that it's by going through their woundedness and bringing awareness and having their heart open instead of just avoiding it and disassociating from their wound. But it's by going through that one is able to extract the gifts. And so I've been, that's really the archetype that's been informing, I think, my life.
And I think it's fair to say that for the last 40 years or so, you've been pursuing a very active study of Buddhism and also depth psychology and also process psychology and Kabbalah and alchemy. And you've really been struggling to integrate all of these resources in order to come to terms with what happened to you.
Yeah, and in essence, the way to describe what I would be studying was the suffering after not only the abuse from my father, and then with the fever, and then when all of a sudden I had internalized the abuser and internalized the trauma, but then add the psychiatry abuse from that, and the suffering was so overwhelming, unlike anything I had ever imagined, that the only reason I was like, oh, let me practice Buddhism or study Jung or study alchemy or study shamanism or study quantum physics or study Kabbalah or on and on and on, anything I found that could in any way to alleviate my suffering, that was the only thing that was interesting to me. The only thing that had any energy, because the suffering was so overwhelming that, it was stopping me from living my life. And, and as the years have gone on, I understand now, it's like, oh yeah, I kind of feel like in a certain way, when Christ, after being crucified and he descends into the underworld for 3 days before he comes back in the resurrected body, it kind of feels like, oh, wow, I've been sort of in that underworld. But like, more and more, it's like I'm able to alchemically transmute it to fuel my creative work. And like I keep on saying, if I wasn't able to do that, I probably would have jumped off a bridge. I really have no doubt about that,
I guess it's fair to say that all of the studying you have done paid off.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think because, the way that I'm synthesizing these wisdom traditions is my own. It's unique. I don't know anybody else who's doing it in the way that I'm doing it. And because of that, it's helpful for people. And, but keep in mind, by doing my studying and my Buddhist practice and my writing and my creative work and my dreaming, all of those are the ways that I'm deepening my own integration and deepening my own healing, and then at a certain point you begin to realize, wow, the suffering that I'm experiencing, yeah, it's my own and it's my own personal suffering. And then, of course, like what part of it is just like my own clinging compared to what part of it is sort of coming from the divine, so to speak. But that suffering, it's not just personal, but then you realize, being archetypal, that you're also feeling the suffering that's in the field, that's in the collective unconscious of our species. And that, the way I see it, is that's the doorway where you can actually more engage with, your bodhisattvic nature. That, oh, wow, if I actually feel this really fully and experience this really fully and express it creatively, it's not just helping me, but that's an offering that's actually adding light to the field and helping other people who are also going through their own version of exactly this process. Because what I was beginning to see when I had my awakening is that, oh, wow, we're not separate. We're actually dream characters in each other's dreams. We're interdependent, interconnected. And out of that was arising this incredible compassion. But the point is that, I was seeing through the separates, through the illusion of the separate self. And, that was in essence the core realization that I was beginning to have. And another way of describing that is like, oh my God, we're having a collective dream. We're all dream characters in each other's dreams, and we're all co-dreaming together.
There's something about your story which also strikes me actually as being archetypically Jewish. I'm thinking, for example, of the sacrifice of Isaac, where God commands Abraham to take his only child and sacrifice him, and Abraham's ready to kill his son, and then God says, "Okay, you don't have to do it now. Sacrifice a goat instead." Or the story of Jacob wrestling with an angel.
Right. I was going to bring up, I totally relate to the Jacob wrestling with the angel thing, where, I write about that story and I ask the question, well, why was he wrestling with the angel? And I point out that he would have been killed if he didn't wrestle with it. So, it was for his own survival. And in a way, I totally relate. Like I was just a completely open-hearted, good, innocent kid. And then unbeknownst to me, these, darker archetypal evil forces came through, into my family, into the petri dish of my family through my father, and destroyed the entire family. And but I all of a sudden was forced. I had to, like Jacob, wrestle with these forces. And, the idea in the myth is that if you make it till dawn, then you've made it, till the light emerges. And then when Jacob does that, the angel, it wounds him on the hip. And that's, I totally relate to that, just symbolic of an encounter with like this numinous energy, with the deity, with the darker God, so to speak. It's a wounding. It's a totally traumatizing experience. And that's why I openly say to people, I totally feel like I'm in, PTSD, but it's like we all are. I realize our species is in PTSD, but there's a way of holding it where it becomes like the elixir for the creative spirit. And then what does the dark angel do? Once he wounds Jacob on the hip, he changes his name to Israel. And the idea being that his nature was changed by the encounter with the God. And so, like, the energy, my father was just an ordinary human being, just totally ignorant. By allowing himself to be possessed by the deeper archetypal force, he became the unwitting conduit for, like, this darker archetypal energy to come through him. And I was the recipient of that. And I've been, like Jacob wrestling with the angel, I've been enacting that myth. And it's completely changed my nature. I'm not, even though I'm totally the same person I was when I was 19, 20, 21, there's another part of me which is radically different. And my state of consciousness is radically different. And the other thing about, like, with Isaac, absolutely, I read in my book that it's like my father I'm the only child, sacrificed his son. And he was willing to sacrifice me for his own narcissism. So it was a little bit different than the way it was presented in the myth. But I'm aware, and I appreciate, Jeffrey, you pointing that out. My story, it's so archetypal, it's so mythic. But the point is, all of our stories have that dimension, not just mine.
I suppose one would have to say there's an element of the Christian myth in there too. The idea God loved his son so dearly that he sent him down to earth to be crucified.
When I was asking, when Gabor Mate, we were talking last week, and it was such a cool interview because it was so unlike anything I was used to, the questions he was asking. And at one point he asked, well, do you feel like you're free? And I had never been asked that, in the moment in a live interview. And I basically said, well, when I connect with my true nature and when I write, I feel really free. But then I began talking about, but then another part of me feels incredibly, like, bound as if I'm crucified. And I literally was talking about how I completely can feel that, like I'm, just crucified on the cross, in the sense of holding the tension of the opposites. And I just experienced that so acutely in the core of my being. And what I've learned is that, to the extent that instead of prematurely dissociating and identifying with one of the opposites at the expense of the other, in which case then I just seem to develop more dis-ease or symptoms. If I can hold that tension, that creative tension, out of that comes, like, something that I couldn't have made by myself, whether you call it grace, the transcendent function, that's Jung's word, the reconciling symbol, or just creativity. So what I do, my daily practice is, I've been carrying my own cross, my own shadow, and just like, it's agonizing to be, like, nailed and holding the tension of the opposites. But somehow I've been able to do that in a way that something, really creative emerges out of that. So I totally identify. Here I'm Jewish and I'm a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, but I'm super into contemplating the Christ event symbolically. Like, how do we and that's the way, by the way, I write about this in my new book. that Christ himself was instructing his disciples to see what was coming through him symbolically. But of course, that got written out of the Bible. It's in the apocryphal texts.
I suppose also when you talk about holding this dynamic tension between two irreconcilable opposites, it's reminiscent of the alchemical marriage.
Oh, totally. Well, out of that potentially comes the conjunctio, the union of the opposites. No, that's absolutely true. And I feel that, at certain moments, but I also feel, like I say, I'm openly, just being authentic. I'm a work in progress. And the thing that's interesting to me, when I am channeling my work, because it feels like I just become an instrument in something, other or higher than myself, then my conscious ego mind comes through. When I'm doing that, I feel so incredibly just, in myself, and I'm doing what I'm here to do, and just filled with light and inspiration. But the thing which is interesting is I notice the more I do that, the more it also seems to attract the darker forces that always want to seem to obscure that or destroy that. And so that's a process I've been tracking, and that, that was encoded in the whole, the drama with my father and with psychiatry. But what I've more and more over the years had the realization of, instead of that being an error, like, I wish that wasn't happening. No, that's like showing me, I'm on the right path. That, of course, the closer you get to the light, it's going to invoke the darker forces to try to stop you. But the darker forces, it's just like when Buddha was becoming enlightened under the Bodhi tree. All of the forces of, like, the evil one, of Mara, came trying to stop him and seduce him, or, screw with him, or tempt him, or just mess with him, do anything and everything to stop him from becoming enlightened. And from one point of view, that's seen as, they're bad, they're obstacles, they shouldn't be there. But no, those evil forces were secretly Buddha's allies. They were helping him to develop the muscle of enlightenment. And, so that's what I'm pointing at, that the darker forces, both in our minds that get constellated as we connect with our light, and the darker forces that are manifesting in the seeming outside world, actually on one level could be seen to be really evil and bad and all that. But the point is that they're also the revelation of something of that darker part of us, and they're actually, like, helping us to actually wake up. An example being, look at what's happening in the world, the coronavirus pandemic. Things have gotten so surreal, it's easier to recognize the dreamlike nature because it's so dreamlike. Just as an example, that encoded in the seeming darkness is like a blessing.
Well, I have to say this, Paul. We tried to record our previous interview 2 times before we were able to do it successfully. Some technical difficulties mysteriously interfered twice. So I have to take you very seriously when you talk about these interfering forces, because I've experienced it with you. And it's the only time I've ever experienced that in the hundreds of interviews that I've done, that these particular technical problems erupted. So it makes me feel like your work is incredibly authentic. And I think you're being very humble when you say, well, you're not really a shaman, because to me, you are.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And, when we had to do it the third time until it actually recorded, and right away after the first 2 times, and I felt, stuff was channeling through, and then you said, oh my God, it didn't record. I right away had the recognition of it's what I call the non-local demon, the NLD, and it's like this non-local demon that pervades the field, that through its connections to the external world, whenever somebody, because I felt like I was really channeling information that was really helpful for people, when somebody's channeling light, the non-local demon will, through its connections to the field, will do everything and anything it can to shut that down. But because we were persistent, that third interview actually, that happened, and that recorded. And I appreciate, the reflection about being a shaman. I just, in no way do I identify with that, because I think of, I have my teachers. If you want to know a shaman, they're really a shaman. My sense, and I wrote an article about this, we're all shamans in training. and I can identify with that. And yeah, I'm a shaman in training, but I'm in no way do I want to like take on that projection of being an accomplished shaman, because it's just not true. And but yeah, I appreciate your reflection though.
My point being that I think you have a lot of wisdom to impart, and I look forward to doing many more interviews with you, Paul, because I feel very touched by not just by your story, but by your insights as well. It was Shakespeare, as I recall, who suggested that life is like a dream, but you've taken that idea and really pushed it much further.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And just one final thing is that I'm not saying in a metaphorical sense that this is that it's like a dream. I actually got into sort of a debate. A very well-known Tibetan Buddhist translator came over to visit me a number of years ago and had tea, and he was saying, no, life it's like a dream, it's metaphorical. And I was saying, no, there's no metaphor about it. This isn't like a dream. This is a dream. This is nothing other than a dream. And we kind of disagreed, but that was fine because it was very friendly and warm. But yeah, that's what I began to have the realization of 40 years ago. That realization has been deepening and deepening, and more I'm finding creative, skillful ways to articulate that. And yeah, and I feel that that's the very thing that all of this, what's playing out in the world, is about. It's like actually showing us the dreamlike nature, and hopefully enough of us will have that realization and connect with other people who are having the realization to the point where we can literally, change the dream. That's what's being offered to us, and that's our hope, and that's evolution. That's, we're actually being invited to step into and participate in our own evolution, and if we don't, have that realization, then we're just going to continue to destroy ourselves. So I just thank you, Jeffrey, and I really hope that, this sort of like point of view really gets out.
I think actually Shakespeare was direct. He said, if I recall correctly, we are such stuff as dreams are made of.
Right, exactly.
Well, Paul Levy, thank you so much for being with me.
I so appreciate it, Jeffrey. Thank you so much.
And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.